Hi there, I'm Thomas, the creative director at Bellular Studios, and today we're going to talk about how we designed the environments of The Pale Beyond, as well as some of the effects, animations, and some of the UI design as well.
If I was really honest, I started with all of my favorite video games which had ice levels, and I didn't research. I actually started making the ice feel really fantastical and spiky and really dramatic, and I was upping the contrast and everything. When I first painted, it was mostly from my head, and before the narrative properly taken shape and found its tone, I wasn't looking at enough references. I was imagining how a lot of those fantastical ice levels and mountains and caves would have felt, and I was painting them there. And as the tone was found and more research was done about reading the initial accounts, I started to get more passionate about the things that were the real details and not my fantastical notion of what the ice should feel and look like. It was a lot more I'd see these sort of really strange phenomena in the ice when I saw the references of what they found, or even in the photography Frank Hurley took on the endurance expedition. A lot of that just struck me as really strange and really interesting, and he obviously was there and he stopped and was like, okay, I need that. I need to capture that. Here's this crazy looking, sweeping, oval shaped cave, and you wouldn't believe some of the things you saw. And then that became a challenge where I had to look even closer at the references, because if I didn't pick up exactly how the light would go through this translucent thing, or how it was water but frozen, and making all these different variances in color, if I didn't look closer at the images, I'd end up making it look fake, and it would look fake unless I started to learn from what was fact. That was a point of no return, where there's older artist Ethan, where he was too concerned with his own idea of what the ice should be like. It's oh yes, I get to paint whatever I want, make any shapes I possibly want, I'll get away with murder. And then after that point, looking back at all those things in relation to the references of what really existed, it just felt fake and bad and wrong. It didn't suit the world that was getting created and the tone that was getting created by the brilliant grounded character designs, the grounded writing, and the things that were much better informed by accounts and real photography.
We found that when it came to putting all of the assets together and how they all kind of worked in tandem with each other, we discovered that there's a really interesting relationship between different elements of the game in terms of fidelity, and that if you raise fidelity in a part of the game almost too high relative to everything else, suddenly everything else feels worse. So when it came to developing different elements of the game visually, we needed to make sure that the environments, the characters, the particle systems, the effects, everything else, the fidelity was kind of working in tandem, and nothing was spiking out so much that it was making everything else kind of feel a little bit weird relative to that.
The game is an expedition. It's a journey through an environment that's vast, and there's a lot of it. And so as a challenge, from the very beginning, I knew we had to make this whole vast kind of desert of ice. So I was always thinking what would be the most production-friendly way to be able to make a lot of art for this setting. And we tried a few things. One way we tried to speed up our art process was to make the camps blocked out with very simple 3D models, and it would be very grey and drab looking, but I could always just see where things were in a perspective camera and then draw over them how I wanted. And that was one attempt to do something about how they're going to keep remaking camps, ramshackle, cobbled together things that requires complete redraws all the time, and then also to feel like a journey, it's got to look different despite everywhere you go. So that was one attempt we tried early on to speed up that pipeline, but we would run into an issue which prompted the consideration of changing to an isometric view, because before, when we had these 3D scenes and stuff, we thought, are we going to do cinematography? Are we going to frame different shots bespokely, and for every time we need something for a story beat, are you looking above the camp, and then are you looking down, boots on the ground, in front of somebody, in front of the furnace? You would have to bespokely draw everything like it was a panel of a comic book, and it was taking a long time. And it seemed like we would be discouraged from creating new content because the cost of it would seem too great, the time cost especially, because it's somewhere else. You're gonna have to block it all out in 3D, then draw over it and frame all the cameras. And this was back when it was very much a prototype, so we had time to experiment and figure out what was best. I was doing like a quick sketchy style to do these paint-overs in a time-effective way. But the problem is that my style, it didn't suit a game that was white. It's a snowy game. It's like a blank canvas. So to get the subtlety of it, I had to paint more, and so that would take more time. So the challenge was, well, I can't paint a full Ghibli-esque shot for every single bespoke camera shot of every single dramatic beat, because everything that we thought was going to give us a lot of room to express ourselves through every shot, it was also a shackle. It was holding us down that we couldn't make as many of them. And it seemed like, yes, because it's a long journey, it's a long expedition, and it's a vast world, my focus became on how some of those camera shots we chose, they were a lot more aerial, and those aerial shots were really working. And the feeling they gave you was the camp is small, man is small, this Arctic wasteland is huge and vast and terrifying, but beautiful too. So we thought about how we were maybe trying to reinvent the wheel when there were plenty of other genres of game that weren't visual novels, but we have RTSs, we have old RPGs where they take advantage of the workflow of an ISO perspective so that you can reuse assets. You could paint a tent that you're seeing from up here and change part of it from, week to week. You could have people get staged in certain areas and have their conversations in quite a modular way. And that prevented any kind of fear about the story necessitating there being more scenes or more conversations, because it wasn't like every single conversation was going to have to lead to me painting a whole new shot to be of a quality I was satisfied with. And I wouldn't have been satisfied with it if we had to rush out loads of sketchy pencil shots of it all. I really, really was falling in love with the way light worked and fell on the ice, and you need to paint that. You need to show the subtlety, because the subtlety is what makes the ice beautiful. It suits it far better to have ISO art that you can paint the ice flow that the camp is on, or the mountain you're at the base of, and know that that's like a stage, it's a location, it's a set that's been made once, and we could have all the events of a number of weeks occur around it. The medium we're working in is a game, and so if the art isn't to sit on a wall and be admired for 10 minutes, it's a space for the gameplay to occur. We couldn't do frame-by-frame animation for everything. We didn't want to make a short film, but there would be a lot of time spent in these camps, and the pace of the kind of world that we're making, it's a very slow pace. You're forced to slow down when you're on the ice, and so I'd use particle effects in Unity where you make like one cloud or whatever, and then you just have it become a sort of modular mist that will just pass slowly over it. And a lot of these effects of like snowfall and maybe like slight little changes in kind of light bloom and stuff, those started out a bit faster, but we found that because the game inhabits this almost like turn-based slow mode sort of feel, a lot of them ended up becoming very, very subtle, very, very slow, and that suited the pacing of the game, as it turned out, to make very, very subtle, passive, very, very chill kind of looping animations through the particles.
So the effects I made for the Pale Beyond included the wind, the birds, the fire, that's a spoiler, and also we tried out a few different things as well. We tried out animation for the UI that didn't make the final cut, and also Templeton's hair during Chill Beats. So my main focus for the effects animation for the environment was to create a nice blend that didn't outstand what was already existing. The emotes had their own style design, the environments were themselves as well. So I was trying to create something that complemented it without taking the spotlight and making it noticeable, because really the player should be focusing on the gameplay and what they're processing. So it was just more of a final touch. So the passive motion animation for the environments was actually quite a challenge, and things like wind and fire happen organically in nature, and trying to figure out something that looped so that you also didn't notice it very obviously in the game ended up being quite a while to try and figure out the process behind that, but I think we came out with something really pretty in the end. Animation, especially hand animation, is a very tedious process at times, and it takes a lot of love and craft to get it to look nice. So we wanted to get the most mileage we could out of what was created with the wind and the fire. So sometimes that included just changing colors or making it a little bit more, how would you say, not obvious as to what it was so that it could be repurposed in other places. We just tried to be very pragmatic about the use of it, and less is more.
So when it came to our initial discussions on UI design, we were originally looking into, of course, how choices are going to be presented and how the crew manifest and basically the remainder of the mechanics were going to aesthetically feel in the context of the rest of the game. We needed the UI to not feel alienated from the underlying art direction. We wanted them to kind of support each other, especially in a game that has so many words and so many choices. It was important that there was synchronicity between those two things. We originally played around with just slightly more kind of default text choices in earlier builds of Pale, but it was looking at aerial footage of ice flows and that really interesting thing that happens in terms of scale, where it can be quite hard to tell how big some of these gargantuan massive ice flows are from that aerial shot against the inky black ocean, where I was looking at them one day in some aerial footage and I went, oh yeah, they look like little bits of ice. And then that idea of how those ice flows would kind of bob on the inky ocean ended up informing how we wanted the actual choices themselves to look in the game. Something that then happened was we wanted the sense of the rest of the UI, your resources, sorry, the crew manifest, and the more organizational elements of the UI to be representative of what you as humans have brought to the ice, not the ice itself. So we wanted it to feel sort of papery, and we wanted it to feel part of the supplies of the expedition. And where we kind of ended up settling on in terms of the visualization of the UI was all of your organizational stuff is papery, and all of the concrete resources you have feel human and sort of set in stone, but the possible choices and the different possible realities of the future were represented by the ice, that kind of the fractalization of what could happen, looking like the way ice flows fractalize themselves. Well, it's a bit reaching, but I think it looks good.
One thing I'm really proud of is the prototype that I created for the delegation wheel, and a beautiful version of it ended up in the final cut of the game. So that was fantastic to actually see something work out so well. I'd spent quite a bit of time watching people through demos and testify and examined how they interacted with the game, and from that we went through the quality of life process and made improvements. So hopefully now everything's a lot more immersive, everyone's happier, and there's less technical difficulties that people run into as well.
The map presented a series of interesting kind of issues that we had to get around. We tried quite a few different variations of the map over the course of development. Of course, the issue being that ice moves and is continuously evolving, and we're in a setting where the game is going to take place over a fairly long period of time. So we had roughly 38 to 39 weeks of this map to cover. And we wanted to make sure that there was a logical consistency to how the ice flows formed and moved over time, and that there was kind of a very vaguely embedded story in the map reflecting the seasons and the time of year. So after banging our heads on a wall and trying various different levels of rendering of the map, Jess ended up coming up with the fantastic idea to use a tool called SpriteShape, which is a Unity tool generally used for sort of bending rendered painterly kind of platforming segments, the kind of Rayman Legends kind of stuff. But yeah, Jess had the fantastic idea to actually develop a style for the map that utilized that. And of course, with Jess's animation background, she was able to keyframe the map over the weeks of the expedition and then have this really interesting through line without having to draw an infinite amount of little bits of ice. Yeah, I'm really happy with how the map came together. Thanks for joining us. Next time, we're going to talk about the audio direction on The Pale Beyond, where you'll get to hear more about how we composed the music and designed some of the Foley, as well as some of the sound effects for the game. Cheers.